Good morning. Before I begin, I want to thank the organizers of this conference for asking myself to attend and present PFC's latest views on this subject. We've been pretty vocal for the last 3 or 4 years on this subject. It's not always a subject that our clients necessarily want us to talk about, but we've done so, and what I'm going to present today is the most recent analysis that we've conducted. We update this yearly, taking into account the most recent discoveries, and this work was finished about 3 or 4 months ago. To start off with here, just a few key messages that I would hope that you all walk away from here, at least messages that we would hope to deliver. And that is that in spite of the high oil prices, and we talk about high oil prices today, but in truth, high prices have been with us now for a guy like myself that's been in the industry over 25 years. High oil prices really go back to almost the year 2000 now. But despite that, we've seen very, very limited growth in production outside of the former Soviet Union and non-OPEC. And in fact, in the last 2 or 3 years, even with high oil prices, production levels have been falling. If you look at the period post-1990, and you've heard this number already today once, but we would agree that right now we are producing about 3 barrels for every barrel that we produce. When you roll all this up into, when you look at current exploration trends, and if you look at current withdrawal rates, production volumes, it's very hard to envision a case where non-OPEC production can increase much beyond the year 2010. It's our view that once we hit 2010 and move beyond that, at best we will be able to hold a production plateau at about 60 million barrels a day, which I'll show you here shortly. There are areas where there is going to be significant production growth, places like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, but as you'll see in this presentation, that growth is largely going to offset production losses that we see from non-OPEC countries outside of the FSU. And probably most important, as we move beyond 2010, with this production plateau in non-OPEC production, all incremental demand is going to have to be accommodated by the ability of OPEC to increase its production capacity. This is our current long-term forecast for non-OPEC. I think maybe the most significant thing to take away from this slide, if you look at that yellow swath which cuts across the middle of the slide, that band of color and everything below that represents conventional crude oil production. So now with Angola having moved out of the non-OPEC group of countries into OPEC, it's very, very difficult in a bottoms-up model like this to envision significant conventional crude oil production increases from where we are right now. There could be some, but by and large we expect that to remain flat, with most total liquids production increases having to be accommodated by growth in unconventional heavy oil, but to a much larger extent natural gas liquids associated with increasing gas utilization globally, and the associated liquids that will take place with that. But this is the dilemma when you take into account that sort of a forecast and you look at various future demand scenarios, which I'm sure we'll hear more about in presentations later in this conference. The call on OPEC crude is going to increase from somewhere between 33 and 36 million barrels a day at the end of this decade to somewhere around 37 to 45 5 years later, and then eventually to somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 million barrels a day within the next 13 years. Just to quickly review, for those that are not very familiar with a typical life cycle for a producing country, you usually, as you heard in the previous presentation, you always find the big fields first. And that holds true for almost anywhere. And you build up a large surplus of crude oil, a large reserve base from which you establish a production increase, a large production profile. But then as exploration results dwindle or success the size of fields falls off, and as production volumes increase, you actually go from years where you have large crude oil surpluses to many, many years of deficit crude oil balances. In other words, you're producing more than you're finding. As that happens, you eventually get to a point where you reach a peak or a plateau. Now, this peak or plateau can last for 1 year, it can last for a decade or more than a decade. But it's pretty easy to go back and reconstruct the history of reserve additions, the history of production, which allows you to very simply come up with a depletion calculation. And when you do that depletion calculation, which is shown in this slide, what you will find is that, by and large, once a country has produced about 50% of its reserves, it's very, very difficult to grow production, and by the time you get to about 60% depletion, it becomes almost impossible to maintain any sort of production peak or plateau, and you ultimately go into production declines. Now, on this slide, I'm showing all the countries which are either in decline or currently in a production plateau within non-OPEC. The bars that you see there represent those years when production has been within this peak or plateau period. So in years to the left-hand side of where those bars are located, all of those countries were in the process of growing or increasing their production volumes. On the right-hand side of all those bars are the years in which the country has gone into decline. What is very significant here is that going back to just the year 1990, globally there were very few countries, just a handful of countries, that had actually gone through that life cycle, through that growth to peak, plateau, and then to decline. Since 1990, we've seen quite a few countries go through that life cycle, and an acceleration in the number of companies which have passed that critical 50 to 60% depletion level and have gone into significant decline. For those countries that have gone into decline, it's pretty easy to go back and reconstruct the actual depletion percentage where that occurred. The global average is about 54%. This is a number that you've heard before. It goes back to Hubbard's ideas of many years ago. What the graph shows is that some countries go into decline much sooner than 50%, somewhere around 40%, but all countries, by the time they get up around 60%, are going to go into some decline at a certain rate. So it becomes a very useful tool in predicting about when a country or a group of countries or a region is going to start going through this life cycle and reaching a point where its overall production numbers will decline. What I'm going to do now is show in a few slides our current outlook for non-OPEC production, excluding Russia, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan. And it's a significant group of countries. It represents about 30 million barrels a day of production, but more significantly, it actually represents about 90% of the reserve base that accounts for the portfolios of most major Western oil and gas companies. Production from this group of companies or countries was flat from about 1998 until about 2 years ago. It was flat right at about 30 million barrels a day, but in the last couple of years, despite this higher price environment we're in, the production levels are now in decline. If you look at the actual volumes of oil discovered versus volumes of oil produced, we are averaging, over this period of time, we're averaging about 4 billion barrels more production every year than reserves found. And in fact, in the last 3 or 4 years, that number has increased to about 6 billion barrels. If the plateau that started back in the late 1990s actually occurred at about a 50% depletion level, and the current declines that we're seeing started at about a 60% depletion level. This group of countries, even if you take into account, and I'll show this in a graph here shortly, but if you take into account the ability of companies to maintain the same level of exploration success going forward over the next 15 years that they had in the past 15 years, which might be an optimistic assumption, that group of countries which is currently producing 30 million barrels a day will be producing 20 million barrels a day by the time we get to the year 2015. These are the different regions which comprise this non-OPEC group outside of the former Soviet Union, and you can see that beginning in, we saw hints of declines going back to 2002, 2003, but I think the last few years' results show that this is clearly the direction the production is headed from this group of countries. If you look at these annual crude oil balances, this is a very simple calculation. It's just reserves discovered minus reserves produced. You can see that we had very large surpluses in the period prior to 1980. We had about a decade where we were breaking even on this score. But once we got into the period of the late 1990s, early 1990s, we clearly went into years when we had consistent negative balances, and that's grown worse over time. To the point where you can see now we're down in this range of 4 to 6 billion barrels of crude oil, more produced than discovered. And this is just a graph that shows again where this decline began and how that is related to the relatively high levels of depletion that we're seeing from the reserves and fields in these countries. Now, if you strip off, and there are plenty of databases around which enable you to do this. If you strip off all of the new production that has been brought on stream since the year 2000, and it's important to realize that although production overall has been flat, it's not because we haven't been bringing on new oil fields. Since 2000, from this group of countries, there's been about 7 million barrels a day of incremental new production brought on stream. The problem is that the underlying producing base, the fields that were existed prior to the year 2000, are currently declining at rates of between 5 and 7% on average. So if you take all the fields that existed just prior to a few years ago, the current decline rate and the reserves and current withdrawal rates would suggest that that group of countries would only be producing about 10 million barrels a day by the time we get out to the year 2020. So there's a very, very large hole that has to be filled. And if you take all of the existing discoveries and you bring those on stream and you project that forward, you can only maintain the current decline rates out through the year 2009, 2010, 2011. So even to maintain the current decline rates that we're seeing over the last few years, there still have to be very significant crude oil discoveries made. So if you roll up in a probabilistic model, taking into account a lot of the uncertainties that you heard about here already this morning, like project slippage, reserve uncertainty, reserve growth, it is virtually impossible to come up with a model, a rigorous model, that would allow us from this group of countries that was producing 30 million barrels a day just a couple of years ago. It's very, very difficult to envision a scenario where this production can be either flattened or stabilized at its current level or turned around and brought back up to its levels of just a few years ago. So this group of countries is probably going to be within just a little over a decade, will have lost about 33% of the capacity that it had just a few years ago. If we now go on to the FSU, Eastern Europe, of course, regional production has been dominated by Russia, but as time goes on here, Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan will continue to grow. Now, unlike the previous region that I showed, if you aggregate all the new production that could come on stream in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan, as well as Eastern Siberia, this group of countries could eventually establish production volumes of between 13 and 16 million barrels a day by 2015. However, a lot of this production growth is going to come from fields, with the exception of Kashagan, fields that have actually been around for a while. And as a result, you're still looking at very significant annual crude oil deficits that are almost equivalent, or roughly equivalent, to the sorts of deficits that you saw from that other group of countries that was producing 30 million barrels a day. And on top of that, regionally, this group of countries is approaching a 60 or 50% depletion level. Although it has a few more years to run, they also will be facing a very similar situation that you see from the rest of the non-OPEC producing group. This again is just a diagram showing this annual crude oil balance, and again, with the exception of the 1 year when Kashagan was discovered, you're looking at negative annual crude oil balances of about 4 billion barrels per year. And this is just a diagram showing that depletion levels are approaching 50%, somewhere in the neighborhood of 45% now. For Russia, the two areas of primary areas of growth are some additional growth, in our view, growth in western Siberia, but also eastern Siberia, which does have a significant slate of large fields that could bring significant production to Russia, assuming that they can work out some of the various infrastructure problems that are going to have to be sorted out prior to this production being realized. But overall, production volume increases from this area of upwards of 1.5 million barrels per day is not inconceivable. Could you go back one? So in an outlook for Russia, there have been a number of these. I'm sure you've seen many of them. But in our view, there is some scope for production increases there from slightly under 9 million barrels a day right now to possibly as much as 11 million barrels a day. But this will be significantly dependent on production increases in West Siberia, as well as the ability to bring on stream those large fields in eastern Siberia. In Azerbaijan, the production volumes there are in the process of being ramped up, and those could go up as high as 1 or 1.2 million barrels a day, assuming that project keeps moving forward. And in the case of Kazakhstan, production volumes there could easily approach 2.5 million barrels a day if the Kashagan field can be successfully brought on stream. And I'm sure many in this audience have heard of a lot of the problems associated with that, including, I think, the most recent cost estimate of something like 30 billion barrels to develop it. So this group of countries could eventually move from where it is now at just slightly under 12 million barrels a day to somewhere close to 14 million barrels a day. But that's going to require an awful lot of good things to happen in terms of the infrastructure development and assuming that a lot of these existing projects can move forward on schedule, which many would argue is going to be a difficult thing to expect. So when you roll all this up into a probabilistic model where you're trying to take into account all of these uncertainties again, we think that there is scope for significant production growth in the former Soviet Union countries. The problem is that there's also a huge amount of uncertainty as you move out into the next decade. Off of a mean expected value of somewhere approaching 15 million barrels a day, you're literally, because of all these uncertainties, looking at a plus minus of 2 to 3 million barrels a day of production. Now, on unconventional heavy oil, we're currently at about 1.7 million barrels a day. This could increase, if you look at all the companies' plans, to something in the neighborhood of 5 million barrels a day by 2015. About 2/3 of this is Canada and will likely to remain Canada. There are lots of challenges to any additional production increases in Venezuela, although a lot of Venezuela will depend on how successful they are in bringing in other national oil companies to participate in that sector, which they're trying to do now. But there are all kinds of challenges, which you've heard some of today already, around costs, labor, materials, politics, environmental concerns, pipelines. So there's a whole host of reasons to expect that this could be a problem. But if you take into account what companies are currently scheduled or have scheduled and what they're arguing they're planning for, there is also some scope for production growth in unconventional heavy oil, up to slightly under 5 million barrels a day by 2015. Of course, there's a significant plus-minus range of 1 million barrels a day around that. And eventually, as you move out towards 2030, we think this number could get up to about 7.5 million barrels a day. And the other area of potential growth is in natural gas liquids. There are some liquids-rich projects around the world, places like Qatar, where there is a lot of associated liquids with the gas that's going to be produced. If you look at recent trends in increased gas utilization in a large number of countries, and the fact that there is a reserve base there to supply that demand, there will naturally have to be some associated liquids growth with that. The growth rate might accelerate a little bit from where it is now, but by and large, our projections are that the growth that we've seen going back to 1990 will roughly remain the same. But that will provide by 2020 upwards of 16 million barrels a day of natural gas liquids to the overall hydrocarbon liquids mix. Now, when you roll all this together, you end up with the picture that I showed in that first slide. You have Russian or FSU production increasing, but only able, for the most part, to offset the declines that we're seeing in the rest of non-OPEC outside of the former Soviet Union. So you're going to end up with an overall conventional crude oil production level roughly close to where you are today in non-OPEC, but some growth in unconventional heavy oil and a lot of growth in natural gas liquids. But at the end of the day, when you roll all this up, you end up with a plateau. It's somewhere around 60 million barrels a day, somewhere between 2010 and 2015. And absent any dramatic increases in recovery technology or absent any new very significant exploration plays, which truthfully most of our clients do not anticipate, we find it very difficult to imagine that non-OPEC production can grow much beyond 60 million barrels a day, plus or minus 1 or 2 million barrels as we move into the early part of the next decade. Now, if we look at OPEC, it's very, very difficult to build a bottoms-up model like you can for the rest of for the non-OPEC countries, simply because you do not have the transparency in the reserves that you have, and that's for a number of reasons. But in places where you have foreign oil companies operating, they have certain rules that they have to follow in terms of what they report in terms of reserves, production plans, and that allows us to have a pretty good window into the reserve base and production capacity in the non-OPEC group of countries. That's also the case in a few of the OPEC countries, like Indonesia, places like Algeria, but there are some critical countries where there is no transparency, and it's very difficult to have the same handle on the reserves and production volumes that you have elsewhere. If you look at the shape and the style of the remaining reserve profiles, really in the face of what is, for the most part, disappointing exploration results within OPEC over the last 20 years, you have to be suspicious about the fact that they maintain relatively flat remaining reserve numbers for virtually year after year. And in fact, it's their policy to have a 0% depletion level, but they do this more through bookkeeping than through the drill bit. If our analysis of OPEC reserves is correct, we believe that they are currently at about a 40% depletion level and that they're depleting at about 1% per year. And simply doing the math, it's hard to imagine that production increases can be sustained within OPEC as you move much beyond the middle part of the next decade, and I'll show that here in a slide in a second. This is the level of reserve deficit that we see in the OPEC countries, which is actually equivalent to both the FSU group of countries and the rest of OPEC countries combined. So in truth, given the current withdrawal rates in the OPEC group of countries, their exploration success has been no better, and in fact some would argue worse, in their ability to replace the volumes that they're producing. So their annual deficits, OPEC's annual deficits, are roughly equivalent to all of non-OPEC's annual crude oil deficits combined. If you look at the current estimated level of depletion, and this is done not by taking the OPEC countries' reserve estimates, but by going back and trying to, by looking at published reports of reserves and various databases of field reserves. When you add those reserves up, they never quite equal what OPEC reports as its remaining reserve number. But by taking those types of estimates and back calculating a depletion level based on the historical production volumes, you can see that there are quite a few critical countries here which are in that range of 40 to 50%, producing at levels of depletion of about 1% per year, not making any significant new discoveries. So it's not hard to imagine that over the next 10 years, a large number of these countries are going to move through that gray swath that you see there and exceed 60%, and there's no reason to expect that these countries will somehow be able to maintain production volumes at higher depletion levels than the rest of the world has been able to do. And this is simply the current depletion level, and you can solve this problem simply by laying a ruler on that, that depletion curve and projecting it forward, and that will take you out to about the year 2015 to 2020. And this is my last slide, and this really illustrates our current view on this topic, and that is that as we move beyond 2010, as I mentioned in that first couple of slides, the call on OPEC crude is going to be very significant. They're going to have to significantly increase their production capacity. Overall, as a group of countries, there are some that can do that, obviously Angola being one of them. But it is our view that at the current rate of new discoveries, that it's going to be very difficult to maintain production volumes greater than 100 million barrels a day. It's a number I think you've heard already once today. I suspect there are others in the audience that have the same number in mind. So we do not, it is not our view that we're looking at an imminent peak in total global hydrocarbon liquids production. It is our view that we've seen we're approaching or are at a non-OPEC conventional peak. We have some scope for growth within the OPEC group of countries. We have some scope for growth in unconventional liquids. But that overall, the real crisis will come at about 100 million barrels a day, which would likely be somewhere in the next decade, depending on what sort of future demand increase you're assuming. Thank you.